Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Challah. We are up to Perek Bet, Mishnah Alayev. Today's Mishnah should be Lelun Nishmat, Neria ben Tzvedlana, Aranbayev, and Eliyahu ben Buchai, Israelov, Menuchatam, Began Eden, Amen. Midoraita, biblically, the Challah obligation applies only in Eretz Yisrael. The Mishnah today is going to discuss the law of grain that was grown outside of Eretz Yisrael, but was made into bread in Eretz Yisrael. Perot chutz la'aretz shenichnesu la'aretz chayivim b'challah. Grain, produce, grown outside of Eretz Yisrael, that entered Eretz Yisrael and was then made into dough there, chayavet b'challah, it is subject to the Challah obligation, because the requirement to separate Challah depends on whether the dough was in Eretz Yisrael at the time when the Challah obligation took effect, which is at the time when it was made into dough. Since this produce was in Eretz Yisrael at that time, it is subject to Challah. And the Mefarshim explain the pasuk Al haaretz asher ani mevi etchem shama in Sefer Bamidbar, chapter 15, pasuk 18, teaches us that even produce of outside of Eretz Yisrael is subject to Challah obligation midoraita if it is in Eretz Yisrael when the Challah obligation takes effect. Now, the obligation to separate Challah takes effect at the time of the kneading, like we will see in chapter 3, Mishnah 6. Therefore, dough kneaded in Eretz Yisrael is subject to Challah midoraita, whether the grain grew in Eretz Yisrael or outside of Eretz Yisrael. But we will see later on in chapter 4, Mishnah 8, that midrabanan, rabbinically, even bread made entirely outside of Eretz Yisrael is subject to the Challah obligation. The Mishnah now discusses the law of grain that was grown in Eretz Yisrael, but was then made into bread outside of Eretz Yisrael. Yatsu mikan l'sham, if the grain went out from Eretz Yisrael to outside of Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Eliezer, and was then made into dough outside of Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Eliezer mechayev. Rabbi Eliezer obligates it in Challah midoraita, because Rabbi Eliezer holds that grain that grows in Eretz Yisrael is subject to Challah, even if it was not in Eretz Yisrael at the time when the actual Challah obligation takes effect, meaning when it was made into dough. Because according to Rabbi Eliezer, he explains, the pasuk says with regards to Challah in Sefer Bamidbar, chapter 15, pasuk 19, right? Vayaki v'yachem el haaretz asher ani mevi etchem shama, and it will be when you eat the bread of the land, you shall set aside a portion for Hashem. Right, the next pasuk after the one I quoted you, and it shall be when you eat of the bread of the land, you shall set aside a portion for Hashem. This implies that as long as it is the bread of the land, meaning it is made from grain that grows in Eretz Yisrael, it is subject to Challah regardless of where the bread is finished and eaten. Therefore, even if it was needed outside of Eretz Yisrael, it is nevertheless subject to the Challah obligation. However, Rabbi Akiva poter, Rabbi Akiva exempts. Rabbi Akiva holds that the place where the grain grows is not a factor in creating a Challah obligation. Rather, it depends on where it became dough. Since it was made into dough outside of Eretz Yisrael, there is no biblical obligation to separate Challah. And the Farshim explain, according to Rabbi Akiva, the pasuk teaches that any dough that has reached the stage of Challah obligation outside of Eretz Yisrael is not subject to the requirement of Challah. Therefore, dough that was needed outside of Eretz Yisrael is exempt, even if it later came into Eretz Yisrael, since the time of the kneading is when the Challah obligation comes into effect. If, however, the dough was needed in Eretz Yisrael, it remains subject to the Challah obligation, even if it left Eretz Yisrael afterwards. And like we discussed earlier, this discussion of the Mishnah is only on the level of the biblical obligation of Challah, b'midrabanan, even bread of grain that grew outside of Eretz Yisrael, that was made in its entirety outside of Eretz Yisrael, is still subject to the law of Challah. And the Rav writes, V'alachak Rabbi Akiva, the halakha does follow the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, that we go by the place where the grain is kneaded into dough, where it became dough, not where it grew. And that is in Abotai Mishnah Aleph. Mishnah Bet now continues to discuss another case of something that was brought into Eretz Yisrael. Afar chutz la'aretz sheba basfina la'aretz, if soil from outside of Eretz Yisrael came on a boat into a river or lake in Eretz Yisrael, meaning the Mefarshim explain a boat containing a load of soil from outside Eretz Yisrael was traveling in a river or lake inside of Eretz Yisrael, chayav b'ma'asrot b'shvi'it, the produce that grows in that soil in the boat is subject to the obligations of both ma'asrot and shmita. And Mefarshim explain, just as a background, ma'asrot are the tithes that a person must separate from his produce. Produce that grows during the year of Shemitah, which is observed every 7 years, is subject to certain restrictions. So, for example, Shemitah produce is considered ownerless and it must be left in the fields for anyone to take. Now, generally, both Ma'aser and Shemitah apply only to produce grown in Eretz Yisrael, and the Mishnah is teaching us here that in our case, the produce is considered to have grown in Eretz Yisrael and is therefore subject to these halachot. Now, the reason being because the produce receives nourishment from the ground under the water. Therefore, it is considered produce grown in Eretz Yisrael, which is subject to the laws of Maaser and Shemitah. Now, although the actual soil in which the produce grows is not from Eretz Yisrael, it is considered produce of Eretz Yisrael since its nourishment, it gets its nourishment from the ground of Eretz Yisrael. Now, this applies, important to note, only if the boat has a hole in it. Now, the hole is filled with clods of earth to prevent the water from coming in. In such a case, the nutrients of the riverbed pass through the hole and reach the produce. However, if there is no hole, the produce is exempt from Maaser and Shemitah because the hole of the boat prevents the nutrients from reaching the produce. This is very important how the Rav points it out. Amar Rabbi Yehuda says he limits the ruling. Ematai, when does this ruling apply? Bazman shasvina gosheshet, only when the bottom of the boat is touching the ground beneath the water, meaning the boat is in a very shallow water and its bottom scrapes against the riverbed. In such a case, the produce in the boat draws nourishment from the ground. However, if the bottom of the boat is not touching the ground, the produce does not draw nourishment from the ground, and in such a case, it is not considered to be growing in Eretz Yisrael, and it would be exempt from the laws of Maaser and Shemitah. The Tanna Kama, however, disagrees. He holds that the produce draws nourishment even though the boat is not touching the ground. Therefore, the produce is subject to the laws of Maaser and Shemitah. This entire discussion is from Masechet. It's discussed in Masechet Gitin, page 8a. The Mishnah now returns to the Achot of Challah. It discusses the law of dough made with fruit juice. Isa shenilusha b'mei perot, dough that was kneaded with fruit juice, for example, apple juice, or really any juice except the 7 liquids that we mentioned in Masechet Machshirin, chapter 6, Mishnah 4, which was dew, water, wine, olive oil, blood, milk, and bees honey. Any other juice would be considered fruit juice for this case. Hayevet b'challah, it is subject to the challah obligation because fruit juice can bond the separate pieces of flour together to form dough. Now, the Mishnah in Masechet Tful Yom, chapter 3, Mishnah 4, cites a machloket concerning the status of dough made with fruit juice. Rabbi Akiva holds that such dough is not considered one entity, but a collection of many particles of flour. His reason is that fruit juice lacks significance, and therefore the separate pieces of flour are not considered to be combined into one entity. But Rabbi Elazar ben Yehuda holds that fruit juice can combine the flour into dough. Now, while the Mishnah there deals with the laws of Tumah, this dispute affects the laws of Challah as well, since only dough is subject to Challah, and therefore, according to Rabbi Akiva, dough made with fruit juice is exempt from Challah because it is not considered dough but separate pieces of flour. But on the other hand, according to Rabbi Elazar, it is considered dough and therefore obligated in Challah. Our Mishnah sides with the opinion of Rabbi Elazar that such dough is obligated in Challah. Maran writes in Shulchan Aruch Chelek Yoreh De'ah, Siman 329 Halakha 10, that nowadays one should avoid kneading a dough purely of fruit juice because since in our times Challah is not eaten by Kohanim, we are faced with the question of how to dispose of the Challah. Now, when the Challah is tameh, like normally in our times, the law is that it's burned. However, food can become tameh only if at some point it was made wet with one of the 7 liquids that we said, which was dew, water, wine, olive oil, blood, milk, and bees honey. But challah made of pure fruit juice does not become tameh and may not be burned, and therefore, in order to avoid this issue, some water or another one of the 7 liquids should be added to the dough. The Mishnah concludes, "V'ne'echelet b'yadayim meso'avot." Challah that is taken from this dough which was made with fruit juice may be eaten with unclean hands, unwashed hands, because dough made with fruit juice cannot become tameh. And like we said, we learned in chapter 1, Mishnah 9, that before touching or eating challah, one must wash his hands. The reason being because the rabbis decreed that unwashed hands are considered tameh, and therefore if someone touches challah without washing his hands, the challah becomes tameh and may not be eaten. But the Mishnah is teaching that in our case, there is no requirement to wash one's hands before eating the challah, because food can become tameh only if at one point it was made wet with one of the 7 liquids that we said, which was dew, water, wine, olive oil, blood, milk, and bees honey. Therefore, if someone who did not wash his hands eats the challah of this dough, it does not become tameh because it was kneaded with fruit juice. And since there is no concern of the challah becoming tameh, the Kohen does not have to wash his hands before eating it. That is in Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.